Hey nerdy knitters, that nose stitch on a knitting chart can be so confusing. So we're going to knit from a chart today. So grab some leftover yarn, your favorite knitting needles, and check down in the video description box below this video. You'll find a file that you can print right now so you can knit along with me. When we're done, you'll know exactly how a knitting chart works and you'll understand that pesky nose stitch and it will never confuse you again. Before we dive in, let me just say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. Now, before we start knitting, there are two things you need to know about working from a knitting chart. The first thing is that every box on a knitting chart represents one action. Sometimes that box refers just to one stitch, the next stitch on your needle, but sometimes that box refers to multiple stitches. 2, 3, or even more stitches can be represented in one box on a chart. So don't think that each box represents a stitch. Each box represents an action that you need to take. The next thing you need to understand about a knitting chart is that it represents the right side or the public side of your knitting. So all of those blank boxes represent knit stitches. On the right side of the work, you knit those stitches. But if you're working a wrong side row, you have to purl those stitches so that knit stitch will be present on the front of the work. And the opposite is also true for those purl stitches. Little black dots on that chart represent a purl stitch on the right side of the work. So if you're working a right side row, you need to purl. But if you're working a wrong side row, you need to knit that stitch so that purl will be present on the right side of the work. I know this is really confusing, but once you understand this concept, knitting charts will be much easier to understand. Now, one more thing before we dive in, I want to discuss that nose stitch on a chart. I know that can be so confusing. The first time I came across it, I thought I was supposed to slip the stitches because I assumed that each box on a chart represented each stitch on my needles. But now that I understand that's not necessarily the case, nose stitch is much easier to understand. Now, when you see a nose stitch symbol on a chart, usually represented by a little gray box, all that means is that that is a placeholder in the chart itself. It doesn't apply to anything that's happening on your knitting needles. That placeholder could be there because there will be more stitches added later on, so we're just making space for it in the chart now. Or it could be there because we've decreased some stitches and that's where stitches used to be. So when we think of each box on a chart as an action, think of a no stitch symbol on a chart as no action. You're just moving over to the next box on the chart and working the action that's in that box. Let's take a look at the chart we're going to knit from. From this chart, that first row is a wrong side row. We can see the numbers are on the right and the left, and number 1 represents a wrong side row because we're working from left to right on the chart. So we move from one box to the next. The first two boxes are no stitch boxes. So we skip right over them and we move on to the next box and perform that next action. Now this box has a dot, which represents a purl stitch on the right side of the work. But we're working a wrong side row, so we know that we have to knit that stitch. And then we move on to the next box and perform the next action. So I hope this concept is a little more clear for you. When you see no stitch on a chart, it just means skip over that box, move to the next box, and perform that next action. It doesn't apply to anything that's on your knitting needles. To really drive this point home, let's compare the chart to the written instructions. Now these are the written instructions for this chart. There's no mention of those placeholder no stitch symbols for that first row. Remember, it's a wrong side row, so those instructions, all it says is knit 3, purl 3, knit 3. Even though there are more boxes on the chart, there's nothing happening on our needles. Now, just discussing this might not be enough, so I want you to get your favorite knitting needles and some yarn. It really doesn't matter what, we're just knitting a little swatch, and work along with me so you can really understand this concept. So if you haven't already, go click on the link in the video description box underneath this video, print that file, and let's start knitting. So after you've cast on 9 stitches, we'll start with that first row, and row 1 is a wrong side row, so we read the chart from left to right. And our instructions here tell us to knit 3 stitches, purl 3 stitches, and then knit 3 stitches. Remember, a black dot on a wrong side row represents a knit stitch, not a purl stitch. So you're knitting 3, purling 3, and then knitting 3.
Now we're on row 2, which is a right side row. So now those black dots represent purl stitches. So we purl 3, then we knit 1, work a yarn over, knit 1, work another yarn over, knit 1 again, and then purl the final 3 stitches. Now row 3 is another wrong side row. We are knitting 3 stitches, purling 5 stitches, and then knitting 3 stitches. Now what you'll notice here is we don't have 9 stitches anymore. Now we have 11 stitches. Those 2 yarn overs from the previous row have added 2 stitches to our stitch count. So you'll see that there is just 1 no stitch box on either side on row 3 instead of the 2 no stitch boxes that we have on row 1. Now we're on row 4. And those black dots again represent purl stitches because we're on a right side row. So purl 3, knit 2, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2, and then purl 3. And you'll also notice we've increased by 2 more stitches, so now we have no stitch boxes on row 4. Now we're on row 5, which is another wrong side row, so those black dots represent knit stitches. So we are knitting 3, purling 7, and then knitting 3 again. Now we're working row 6, so we purl 3, and then we have a decrease, an SSK, and then knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, and then a knit 2 together. And then those final 3 purl stitches. So we have some decreases on this row along with our increases, so they cancel each other out. They're sort of a pair. Every increase has a paired decrease, so our stitch count will remain the same for this row and for row 7. And row 7 is a repeat of row 5. We are knitting 3, purling 7, and knitting 3 again. Row 8 begins with a purl 3 and then a decrease, an SSK, knit 3, knit 2 together, and then purl 3. Now we have no yarn overs and we're working 2 decreases, so we have decreased our stitch count by 2. So you'll notice that now we have those gray no stitch boxes on either side of row 8 because we've reduced our stitch count. Row 9 is another wrong side row, so those black dots represent knit stitches. Knit 3, purl 5, and then knit 3 again. Row 10 is a right side row. Black dots represent purl stitches on these rows. So purl 3, work an SSK, knit 1, work a knit 2 together, and then purl 3. So we have 2 more decreases, but no paired yarn overs, so our stitch count is now reduced again by 2 stitches. So you'll see that we have 2 more gray no stitch boxes on either side because our stitch count has been reduced. Now we're on row 11. This is a wrong side row, so knit 3, purl 3, and knit 3, just like row 1. Now we're on row 12. We have to purl 3, work a yarn over, work a double decrease, work another yarn over, and then purl 3 again. So this double decrease, you slip 2 stitches together as if to knit, knit 1, pass those 2 slipped stitches over the stitch that was knit. And you'll see that that 1 box actually represents 3 stitches. And all of these increases and decreases create this pretty little leaf pattern.
Now I'm sure you're feeling more confident about understanding knitting charts now that you've actually knit from one along with me, but there's more that you need to understand about knitting charts. The difference between flat knitting and in the round knitting and how that looks on a chart, the way different stitch patterns are worked on a knitting chart, and plenty more. And we'll look at all of those topics in this video right here where we dive deep into knitting charts. So click on this video next and I'll see you over there.